guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be doing a topic that I actually missed out on in my videos. We're going to be doing Lenin. I haven't touched this in a while, so excuse me if my knowledge is a bit rusty. I will be referring to it consistently. I'm going to try and make this as quick as I possibly can, so let's start. With Lenin, let's start by looking at the rise to power and context. So obviously, with the Nicholas II video, we'd been over the February Revolution in 1917, where the Tsar abdicated after his officers persuaded him. The Petrograd Soviets then came into power. You had the dual-party system with the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviets, where, the Soviets had the power but not the authority, and vice versa. And the provisional government, the reason it was looked down upon and not preferred by the common people was because they were seen as Tsarist sympathizers. They also had no means of controlling the masses, which meant that they had to reintroduce military ranks and punishment, and even the death penalty at a point. So Lenin opposes this idea. Basically, the provisional government wants Russia to stay in World War I. They want them to continue fighting, but the people obviously don't want this. The soldiers out there are peasants. They don't want to keep fighting. They want to go back home, and that's one of the reasons why the Soviets come into power, especially the Bolsheviks, because Lenin opposes the idea of going back to war, and he proposes the idea of bread, peace, and land in his April thesis, where he says that, obviously, we need to consolidate our own nation. Nobody wants to be in a war. We shouldn't be in a war. We should be, better off, more abundant, and we shouldn't be seen siding with these are sympathizers. And as of 1914, 1921, with World War I, there were 21 million Russian deaths. So obviously numbers weren't looking great. Morale would have been low. People would not have wanted the war to continue back home in Russia, which leads to the Russian Civil War, which I will get into in 1 minute. So the Soviets come into power after the October Revolution. The Soviets were scared of not the Soviets, this was just Petrograd Soviets. They were scared of responsibility. They were very liberal and they had a lot of strong ideas, but they didn't know how to execute it. So that was part of why the two-party system might have worked for them. With the February Revolution, food prices had risen to 755% of 1914, so they were pretty insane at the time. You also had the Kornilov affair in 1917, August, where the Bolsheviks came out as heroes because they prevented this coup. Okay, let's move on to the October Revolution in 1917. So the Bolsheviks basically come into power. They have, although limited power, they're still not very stable in their position. One of maybe, oh my god, some of these are so, okay, these notes are horrendous. After the Bolsheviks come into power, they have a parliament in Ukraine, I think. I don't know, because my notes are so awful at this point. Let's ignore that. Okay, so they have the Decree on Peace, where basically they decide that with World War I, they want peace without annexation and indemnities. I started with indemnities. And they also move against sexism in culture, because they want, obviously as many votes as they can get, even from women. However, the opposition requests that they get a constituent assembly because they don't want it to be a one-party system. At that point, there was still some liberality, you could argue. So the opposition get their wish. They get a constituent assembly, and it only sits for 1 day, the 5th of January 1918, at the Tauride Palace, which, if you remember, was where the Tsars ruled. And they were just kicked out. They were kept out by the Bolsheviks, who came in with, mercenaries, and they were like, you are not getting in. So, yeah, also the Soviets, the Bolsheviks, they nationalized banks, so there was no more private capital flowing in the country. Uh, yes, and now one of the crowning glories of the early days of Bolshevism, I would say, would be the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Brest-Litovsk. I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's Brestlitovsk. Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918. Which basically was like the peace treaty where they were like, hey, annexation without indemnities. More or less got that. Before we move on to Russian Civil War, I would like to reinforce that. Do you remember with the provisional government how they introduced military ranks because they needed to get control of the population? Well, the Bolsheviks come into power and they remove ranks and military decorations like salutations and stuff. Which, when you think about it, you kind of need a hierarchy in place in an organization as disciplined as the army, ideally, but obviously that comes back to bite them. Right, so let's move on to the Russian Civil War, which went on from 1917 to 1922. The Russian Civil War was fought between the Reds and the Whites, not being racist. The Reds were the communists, the peasants, the Bolsheviks, basically anybody supporting a Bolshevik party in power, and the whites were the monarchists, and a lot of foreign countries, because interestingly enough, the foreign countries who were still engaged in World War I wanted Russia back in the fight to support them, so they funded this so that they could get rid of the Bolsheviks who wanted, the war to stop. There were also the Greens, who were like peasant mercenaries who would just switch sides and get into silly disputes. I say silly, but like Civil War and stuff. So the Reds end up winning. Why is that? Well, first of all, easy win because they have great propaganda. Think about it. You have the whites who are being sponsored by foreign powers. How's that going to look to the common Russian peasant that they are traitors, that they're making deals with foreigners? Of course we can't choose them to represent us, so that was great for, communist propaganda. They also had a better location. They were sort of in the heart of the country. They had more geographical space. And then you also had Trotsky, who played a really important role. Obviously, it's not great to give into, the Trotskyist myth that he single-handedly saved the war, but historians like Service speak of Trotsky's brilliance. So he was great. He was really in touch with the line of command. He had a train and an armored car. He would, go around with it, and he would try and help as much as he could with strategy and actual fighting. Unlike other Bolsheviks who didn't actually do much. So, they also had a really clear line of command that helped that they were organized. And at that point, Russia is starving and destitute, with World War I, and they really don't want more of what's going on. Why did the whites lose? Well, like we said before, they weren't organized. There was a lot of internal division. They also killed 100,000 Jews. So anti-Semitism was a really strong sentiment with them. They also returned land to landowners, which polarized almost all peasants against them, because you're going against the demographic. Does that make sense? Anyways, so that was the Russian Civil War, and as a result of that, you had Lenin introduce the system of war communism from 1918 to 1921, basically an attempt to adapt the economy to fund them. How did they do this? Let's get into it. War communism, I would say, was a very, very harsh method of raising production, but then again, you have Stalin and his collectivization program, so this probably pales in comparison, but anyways. War communism, during it, they attempt to abolish currency and encourage bartering as a system. doesn't do well. The ruble drops in price value, and there is insane inflation. Um, they try to make the state the sole producer and distributor, so they end privatization, and that does not go well, you would imagine, with food shortages. So you also have state control over labor, which basically meant that if you were like a police officer, you had just served, you would then go in to do hard labor at farms. So yeah, and then you had the Supreme Economic Council who were sort of in charge of this. What were the impacts of war communism? Well, obviously, you know, not a lot of food. There was a great food shortage, which led to a lot of subsistence farming. There were food rations. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure they needed aid from They needed aid from foreign nations at a point. And would you look at payback? This could be a really false number, but 80,000 members of the party were murdered by peasants because of this. So, if that's your parameter for success, not successful. They also have the mass execution of 800 enemies of state in 1918, which is beyond me what that could mean. I'm assuming anybody that would want to oppose war communism. Then you have, that obviously leads to the Great Famine of 1918 with a death toll of about 5 to 8 million. And the industrial levels were now running at 30% of 1913. Insane. But what was the crowning glory? What was the moment of revelation when Lenin had to go, oh, this isn't working? Glad you asked. It was the Kronstadt, Kronstadt, the Kronstadt Sailors Revolution, where basically they sent a bunch of demands to Lenin saying that, oh, we don't want this, we don't want one party ruling over us. That really scared Lenin, pardon my French, shitless. And 15,000 of these sailors were shot. So, did not go well. However, it forced Lenin to think that maybe this wasn't a policy to take, which, you know what, think about it, you could have realized that without killing 15,000 people. 15,000 people serving your country. Anyways, so you had then the introduction of the new economic policy, which sounds pretty new and pretty economic, so let's get into it. The new economic policy had a much more liberal and capitalist approach to the economy. How so, Thea, you ask? I will tell you. Well, first of all, they introduced, let's move down in levels. So they stopped the requisitioning of grain. So they were no longer collecting like grain at local level. They encouraged private ownership of small banks and businesses, which what it did was, no more privatization, so you've got new currency flowing into the country. And that also allowed them to introduce taxes, which obviously brought in more money for the government. You had a freer market, significantly more, or relatively more foreign trade, and you had like surplus grain being sold for profit, with grain production being increased by 50% in 1923. And it also created this class of the NEP men, or the NEP men, who just got rich off of this business of trading. And they were like rich new private business owners, like so nouveau rich. Anyways, interesting point of this would be the scissors crisis, which Trotsky named it in 1923 due to foreign trade. What does that mean? Well, the scissors crisis. Why is it named that? Because the graph shows like a intersection where they kind of switch and it looks like scissors. But what happens basically is the level of production in towns of goods was greater than that in industries. So towns were flooded with goods and they had nothing to exchange. So the price of amenities increased. I don't really know the fiscality of it, but sounded bad. Okay, and then you had the Red Terror. This is more social political, but you had the Red Terror in 1918, which saw to the use of gulags and Cheka repression under Felix Dzerzhinsky. So you had the Cheka under Felix Dzerzhinsky with over 200,000 members by 1920, and they sought about 8,500 people being executed. And there was also the hanging order in Penza, which Lenin issued to execute 100 peasants. Sad days. I mean that genuinely. I know my tone doesn't always come off well. Okay. We should initially have gone over this, but I didn't because I glanced over it. But let's talk about the features of rule under Lenin. This actually comes under Stalin, but I'd like to discuss it now because it's more relevant, and I'd rather have all of Lenin in like one place. So you had nationalization, so no more private capital. You had purges and show trials like that of the Moscow clergy in 1922. That is my favorite one to quote. I use it every time. It was the Moscow clergy and socialist revolutionaries. Then you had Trotsky's ban on independent trade unions. You had the ban on factionalism, which actually ties into Stalin later. You had the police state, the politicization of the law. You had the one-party state, so all other parties were banned, and you had the bureaucratic state, which basically encouraged democratic centralism. Let's end it off with some historiography. So Lenin brought the dictatorship of Lenin brought the dictatorship of the Communist Party over the people, and not the working class over the middle class, as he had initially intended to, says Rosa Luxemburg. That brings us to a rising end. To Lenin, and I believe I've already done Stalin. That leaves us with a little bit more of paper 2, some Cold War, some Mao, and then some paper 3 stuff to finish off. But that was it. So thank you for watching. I hope you keep Lenin in.